2016 is finally over, and I just want to say thank God for that. It was kind of a terrible year, all things considered. With respect to video games, there was really a lot of great and interesting things happening. There was an enormous number of video games that came out this year, the majority of which were actually quite great despite a few disasters. We saw VR, we saw a lot of really interesting things happen this year. First-person shooters really changed for the better. Indie games came into their own in a way that I wouldn't have guessed. We just saw such an enormous number of high-quality, diverse indie games from so many publishers. They are really at the point where they're completely competitive with AAA games. And it was just kind of a mind-boggling year in terms of video games. There was so many games to play that I couldn't even play games that I'd been looking forward to all year. With that said, this is going to be a quick look at my 10 or 11 favorite games of the year. It's just going to be kind of a candid, unscripted video, taking a look at what I thought was really important and distinct in this year. So I hope you enjoy. One of the most interesting trends that we experienced in 2016 was the final death of the modern shooter. For about a decade, that setting was all we had when it came to first-person shooters. And this year we saw fantasy settings. We saw science fiction games, and Battlefield 1 took us back to World War I. And it did so with enough reverence and, I would say, comedy, which seems like a strange mix, but it did so with enough of the wackiness of 1942 to really make it a great entry into the series. I've always been a huge fan of the Battlefield games, going all the way back to 1942, because they're just large-scale sandbox gameplay. It just creates for emergent gameplay moments that you just don't see in other games. And the kind of crazy stuff that happens in a Battlefield match, for me, rivals the most insane set piece you're going to see in any scripted linear type game. Graphically, this game is probably unparalleled. I think it might be the very best looking game on the market. Battlefield 1 is my number 10 game for 2016. At number 9, I have an unusual game for me. I'm not somebody who really enjoys narrative-driven games as much as a lot of people do, so I was surprised when I really enjoyed Campo Santo's Firewatch, and that is my number 9 pick for 2016. It's the debut effort from a studio of people who come from different development backgrounds. Some of them worked at Double Fine, some of them worked on the Walking Dead games, and I believe they worked on Sam & Max or some of these other adventure games. Firewatch is what is derisively or not referred to as a walking simulator. So basically you're put in a large, extremely beautiful and lush open world and given some freedom to explore it while a story unfolds around you. And the writing in this game is just top-notch, and it's even more improved upon by the fact that the voice acting is some of the best I've seen in video games. There's really only 2 characters in this game, Henry and Delilah, and their back and forth is believable, heartfelt, and really drives the story along. Now, the thing I would say about a game like this is it's not extremely long, though I think it's priced appropriately for its length, but it's the sort of game that you want to play in one sitting. You don't want to stretch this out over multiple sittings. It's the type of story that's best experienced in one sitting. So find yourself a day where you've got 4 or 5 hours of free time and grab yourself a copy of Firewatch and sit down and play it from beginning to end. It's really an incredible experience, and I think just a great example of new directions that video games can go that are not combat-focused and still deliver interesting gameplay, interesting immersion, and great storytelling. Number 8 is Salt and Sanctuary. Now, when I first saw this, it looked like a very simple Dark Souls D-make. Yet when I finally got the chance to play it, it seemed to me that it was a much deeper, much more interesting game, despite on the surface seeming to be nothing more than a Dark Souls clone. Salt and Sanctuary takes the combat and stylings of Dark Souls, but delivers it into one of the better Metroidvania games I've ever played. The tension that you experience between sanctuaries, which are what the bonfires of that game are, is actually much greater than what I experienced in this year's Dark Souls 3, because the distance was often just far enough to really just crank up that tension. It's a challenging game with incredible boss battles, a good soundtrack, and just really good combat. I highly recommend it to anybody who's a fan of Castlevania, Dark Souls, or just 2D indie games.
Super hot. Super hot. Super.
Is it the most innovative shooter I've played in years, or is that just what the game told me to tell you? Super Hot is an incredible experience from beginning to end. It's a short game, but it offers enough replayable modes like the Endless mode at the end of the game to give you quite a lot of content. I've never played a first-person shooter that played anything like this. The way it works is time is just about frozen. It's just barely crawling forward, and any movement you take speeds time up. So you kind of have this Matrix-like bullet time advantage over the people you're fighting. However, clever level design, enemy placement makes it so that these levels are very challenging. They often put you in a place where you have multiple bullets flying at you at once. Cars are coming at you, and you have to dodge the bullets, kill the people, get out of the way of the cars, and do it all super stylishly in the coolest way possible. Super Hot is an experience. It's an experience that is incredibly fun to play. I cannot recommend Super Hot enough. As I said before, 2016 has been a particularly good year for the first-person shooter, and of course I'm talking about Titanfall 2. The thing that sets Titanfall 2 apart is the feel of the game. It just gives you this feeling, this frenetic feeling of momentum and forward movement and just control of your character that I don't think I've seen in another game. Just jumping around the map and just wall running and sliding and mastering the sort of crouch hopping is really, really entertaining and rewarding. And when you're playing through the single player of the game, which I think is actually quite excellent, and it's sort of a mixture of the best of Half-Life 2 and the best of your favorite COD single player, and it really, I think, improves upon both of those. I would take it over Half-Life 2 or really any Call of Duty campaign, but I'm not a huge fan of Call of Duty campaigns. The single player for this game is just spectacular because of how well it incorporates that sense of speed and game feel and movement into just a frenetic gunfight crazy environment. The multiplayer is incredibly addictive and is probably going to end up being the multiplayer game I play the most in the next few months, along with Battlefield 1. Titanfall 2 is definitely one of the best games of the year. Devil Daggers is both a hobby and an obsession. It's a distillation of everything that makes a first-person shooter great. It takes the core mechanics of old-school FPSs and puts them into a Geometry Wars in Hell type environment. And basically, your only goal is just to survive onslaughts of enemies for as long as you can. And that might sound simple, but this game is one of the most challenging and difficult games I've ever played. While it's not technically a roguelike in any particular way, it reminds of something like The Binding of Isaac or Spelunky, with this just one more try. Every try is a little bit of knowledge learned, a little bit of progression. Even though you died, you've learned something new, and you're hopefully going to take that knowledge and put it forward in your next run and get just a little more time. It has excellent use of a leaderboard system that allows you to watch the best in the business and also compete with your friends directly to see who can get the best time. Stylistically, Devil Daggers is one of the most interesting things to come out of the indie scene. It's really a game that everybody ought to play. For $5, you just can't go wrong, and it's definitely one of my top 5 favorite games of this year. One of the most beautiful games I've ever seen, Hyper Light Drifter draws on everything from 2D Zelda games to Dark Souls. It places you in a stylish world of danger and intrigue, and is really an example of some of the best pixel art I've ever seen in a game, and just evidence that pixel art is a form of art in and of itself. Precise and deliberate combat made for an extremely high degree of challenge and rewarding gameplay. The boss battles in this game are some of the most tense and incredible boss battles I've seen all year long, and really even in a few years. They remind me of the very best of a Dark Souls type or Devil May Cry boss battle. Upping Dark Souls is in deliberately unique, opaque storytelling. Hyper Light Drifter paints a portrait of a world in decline and lets you just have just enough pieces to put that story together and make sense of it yourself. The color palette, the sound design, and the soundtrack for this game are really some of the best I've seen coming out of the indie scene, and just evidence that indie games are now at a point where they are completely competitive from an audio-video standpoint with AAA games. Like, you're not getting a cheap pared-down piece of crap that looks like an NES game anymore. You're getting high-quality, beautiful, well-thought-out games. Hyper Light Drifter is my number 4 game of the year. At some point in your initial playthrough of Darkest Dungeon, you're going to start to wonder if you've been playing the game wrong. If investing in your characters, naming them after your friends and family, and trying to stave off their disease and affliction has actually been the right course of action, or whether you should have just been working them to death, allowing them to get disease and affliction, and then firing them. It's a tough choice, and the game intentionally provokes this tough choice. Perhaps the best example in recent years of mechanics as metaphor, Darkest Dungeon forces you to choose between investing in the people that you hire and your party members and trying to nurture them and keep them alive at great cost and at a much slower pace of development, or just using them like slaves, chewing them up and spitting them out to accrue wealth and progress as quickly as you can through the different dungeons. Darkest Dungeon is an RPG game, a roguelike in a true fashion. It has turn-based combat, permadeath, and an autosave feature that makes it so that when any character you have dies in battle, they are lost forever. This means that you have to kind of manage two casts of class members. The ones that you are investing in, that you only use occasionally when you know you're going to win, and you equip with the best gear, and then the revolving door of essentially slave workers that you bring in, drive insane, and then fire or leave for dead. It's an interesting choice, and it's one that might make you feel like a bit of a scumbag as you play the game. But the incredible combat, the narrator, the whole setting of the game just immerses you and drives you to play deeper and deeper. Darkest Dungeon, it's a perfect example of a game going into early access and coming out as a feature-filled, just really high-quality game. A game that is my number 3 game of the year. This may not come as much of a surprise, but Dark Souls is my favorite game of all time. The 2011 classic sort of made me fall in love with single-player experiences again at a point in my life where I was really only enjoying multiplayer shooters and things of that nature. So Dark Souls 3, while not necessarily innovating on that core blueprint, has in a lot of ways refined and proved to be a sort of greatest hits for the series. So it's not surprising it shall end up number 2 on my list of the best games of 2016. I would say that Dark Souls 3 perhaps placed bonfires a little too close together or a little too often. It had some pretty great boss battles, particularly like the Nameless King, but the DLC was a little short, and the whole game felt a little bit more like a retread of what's come before than anything profound or new. It's still a great game, and one I will continue playing, and admittedly probably the game I played by far the most this year. It's a game I will continue to play. It doesn't quite match the pinnacle of earlier games in the series like Demon Souls or Dark Souls. It is, however, my number 2 game for 2016. This might seem like a little bit of a cheat, but my number 1 pick for 2016 is going to have to be a tie between 2016's Doom and 2016's Hitman. Both self-titled reboots, these games defined what 2016 meant for me in gaming. They moved away from pretty much everything that had become commonplace for the past decade and paved their own route. Instead of trying to do a little bit of everything, they focused on doing one thing and doing it really well. Doom's campaign is probably the best first-person shooter campaign this entire 21st century. Its frenetic sense of pace and movement and just brutal, constantly rewarding combat will just bring you back time and time again. I've already played through the game twice completely, and I probably will go through and do it again this year. Hitman took everything I loved about games like Dishonored, Metal Gear Solid 5, and put them in an entirely new wrapper. Instead of doing a stealth game in a high combat environment, they put you in mundane environments with no expectation of violence and asked you to do really interesting things in whatever way you chose to do it. In so many ways, it's what I wish every Dishonored level would turn out to be, or how I wish I could play every Dishonored level. Its approach to player agency and the number of options that are available to you are just so incredible. I've found myself playing just the first Paris mission for about 25 hours before finally moving on to Sapienza. It's a game that you can literally play forever and constantly find new things, and it's the game that made me realize that a can of tomato sauce is more deadly than a gun. Doom and Hitman 2016 are my number 1 picks for this year. Alright, thank you for watching. That has been my top 10 games of 2016. I don't take numbered lists that seriously, so I hope you won't either. I do think that Doom and Hitman were particularly special games this year that really stood out among the others. But we saw some other really cool stuff, like the sort of high-bit revolution with games like Owlboy and Hyper Light Drifter, and games like Titanfall just kind of taking the first-person shooter in a really different and new direction, which I like. We did a podcast with my friend Orrin Luke, who has a YouTube channel, not just a video game. Orrin Luke, you can find him in the doobly-doo, and you can also find a link to the podcast down there. We talked for about an hour and a half about 2016, our favorite games, and what we liked about them, and the different trends that we saw over that year. I think it's a great discussion, and I think if you enjoy this show, you're really going to want to see that. Please check out his channel and that podcast. A lot of interesting stuff coming up next year, or I guess it's this year, 2017. Kevin Johnson is going to be making mini documentaries about the personal experience and effect of gaming and gaming culture, and we're going to be looking at more stuff on the NOSHOW. So I want to thank you for watching. I hope that you enjoyed this video. Please don't forget to like, favorite, subscribe, all that, and leave a comment in the comment bar. Thumbs up if you liked it, thumbs down if you didn't. You have a great year. I'll see you around.